listening to the Dodcast with me, Luke Dodson, and my guest today is Dustin Broadbery. Dustin is an investigative journalist who's been published at Activist Post, Off Guardian, and who runs his own blog at thecogent.org. Today we're talking about the co-optation of activism by the state. I've been looking at your work on the website, all really fascinating and very much dovetailing with something generally the topic that I'm interested in at the moment, which is, as you put it in your recent article for Off Guardian, the co-optation of activism by the state.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me as though in the past sort of 20 years or so particularly, that this has become so subtle and immersive in a way.
I think so, yeah, and it goes beyond just activism. I think it kind of pervades into all aspects of life, particularly spirituality. I mean, I'm writing a piece at the moment on, how the whole kind of pandemic has been a major attack on our kind of spiritual systems and our ability to surrender to the journey and be in the moment, relinquishing, worldly illusions and all of that stuff. Coronavirus and the pandemic and the kind of government's overstep into having some kind of dominion over our lives, over our death, all of this stuff. And then you look more closely at spirituality and you see that, it's kind of become this sort of body consciousness, Spotify, type experience that's sort of, that is underscored by billion-dollar apps and stuff like that. So I think money tends to kind of like pervade into everything, no matter how pure it is. And, going back to the kind of co-opting of activism, yeah, I think going back to the 60s, the CIA were in Vietnam fighting a war there. And they realized the future of warfare was not going to be about nation. It wasn't going to be with nation states. It was going to be with small grassroots organizations who had the power, like the Viet Cong, to create movements that would become revolutions, that would topple regimes, that would put, counter kind of governments and states in place, both at home and abroad. So they realized at that point, that counterinsurgency was the way that future wars would be fought. So they developed programs like ARPANET, that you may have heard of, and DARPA, which became the kind of the precursor to the internet.
Right.
Interestingly, so there's definitely been a war on activism because it's a potentially insurgent, community that could topple existing status quos, So it kind of, this all goes, I think it's all within the kind of war on culture that we're seeing. It all kind of circles back to kind of Orwell and Newspeak and, attenuating language and culture so that we simply don't have options at the end of the, the voyage of discovery, that all those options are kind of owned by the state and all roads lead back to the same place.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you come across the work of Douglas Valentine at all?
I don't know him, no. I'll make a note.
Yeah, he's a journalist who's written quite a bit about the CIA and their influence on domestic American politics, as well as stemming from. He wrote a book in the mid-90s about the Phoenix program.
Okay.
Very much sort of tying in with the things you were talking about controlling counterinsurgency worldwide, and he's got sort of first-hand experience of how the CIA has, and other intelligence organizations have kind of saturated various levels of academia and media.
Oh, yeah.
He's kind of, he writes about how when the book came out, it was sort of panned in journals like the New York Times and things, because of course there were members of the staff there that were insiders, and they went, oh, we can't have this amazing book about the CIA and all the terrible things that we did coming out and people reading it, so we'll just slate it. And that's there's a real kind of subtle means by which information can be controlled just by making it kind of beyond the pale. So it's like, and you know, as I'm sure you've picked up, the way that, you know, certain ideas, if you just get certain kinds of people to say them in a particular way, all of the kind of, all of the sort of intelligentsia, all the people that like to think of themselves as being, you know, really forward thinking and questioning everything, will be like, oh, well, I don't believe in any of those weird conspiracy theories because of those people that said them. But there's nothing intrinsically about any of those ideas that is wrong. It's just that it creates this kind of tribalism.
Yeah. Well, it's like what Orwell says in 1984. He says, perhaps you imagine a huge network of conspirators prepared to commit any atrocity to weaken and demoralize the order of society. The reality is infinitely more subtle. And I think the state operates on very subtle nuances, okay, to control and subvert, to create monoculture. You know, everything from the kind of left-right polarization, okay, through to taking over, you know, grassroots movements in order for them to be able to do the unofficial bidding of the state. You know, when you control most of the apparatus within a society, so for example, you control the money supply that is all based on debt, and, you know, parents, for example, are too preoccupied with actually earning a living to be properly educating and socializing their children. So their children go to a schooling system that is built on the old Prussian education system, that is all about raising armies, raising, you know, conforming future soldiers to uphold and support, you know, the state. And then you look towards kind of social media and digital technology and how it has, you know, how, for example, like social media is like a dopamine plantation, you know, that is all about us creating neutral content so that we may please as many people as possible and get optimum likes. You know, all of this stuff plays on our brain chemistry. And the state knows this because they have bought all the best scientific papers. They own, or at least they can buy, all the best kind of philosophers, psychologists, anthropologists, you know, people who have studied the human condition and understand what our levers are, okay? So whilst we look at the kind of bigger picture, you know, of left and right, of these polarizations, we kind of miss the subtle nuances. And that is how our operating system kind of works. And the state knows that very well, and it understands how to push the buttons and tweak the knobs to create, you know, a well-behaved kind of conformist, you know, citizenry. I think there's a major war on the individual and diversity right now, and I think that's one of the big takeaways of both the pandemic and basically just the kind of changing structure of society over the past couple of decades. You know, we've had things like class wars, we've had the war on the working class, etc. But I think when we have this global village that emerges from technology, because don't forget that, you know, Google, Facebook, these are all kind of pretty much socialist structures of totalitarianism, because what they do is they create a monoculture, you know, that transcends all kind of nation states. They create their own rules, their own regulations, where you can be banned or blocked for saying the wrong thing, you know. So within social media, for example, digital technology, there is a kind of alternative reality that is emerging. And it's not just an entertainment apparatus. These are instruments that actually inform our ideas of citizenry. They give us our knowledge, our information. They're like maps to show us where we are on the world, you know. But they are controlled by a kind of monopoly, and they are you know, whitewashing diversity. So there's a lot of stuff, I think, happening at the moment we must be aware of and draw attention to, that is dumbing us down, I think, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, with Facebook and Google and things like this, and on all the social media platforms, I think a lot of people tend to sort of say things like, well, you know, you have the option to, they're private companies, and you have the option to not use them and to go elsewhere, and which is technically true up to a point, but it's the same problem as the way in which American political economic policy, a corporation is regarded as an individual competing with individuals. So it's like, well, Walmart is considered to be in competition with the little, you know, mom and pop store down the road.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not a competition because Walmart can just swallow that up without even thinking about it. You know, YouTube or Google or Facebook, they're actually, you know, these aren't just private companies anymore in competition with other private companies. These are effectively state apparati. These are kind of transcending even nation state apparati into something, as you say, something much more totalizing, you know.
What is interesting about what you said there is the fact that back in the day, people would kind of get together by leaving notes in a pub or speaking to the landlord and saying, if you see so-and-so, if you see Luke Dodson, tell him I'll be in the Hope and Anchor at 10 p.m. on Thursday, and we'll go to that event. So people still convened and congregated, and probably in a much bigger way 20, 30, 40 years ago, okay? They still got together. They didn't have even landlines, let alone mobile phones or social media, okay? But they still managed to come together in the same way that birds fly together in the same formations, you know? There is something built into human nature that I think just brings us together naturally. As you stated there, Walmart taking over from kind of Mart and Pa's organic shop down the road, there is no level of competition there. But what it subtly does, it subtly buys up the entire supply chain so that you can't actually shop in Mart and Pa's anymore because you just can't get the prices. You can't get the diversity of products because Walmart have got the monopoly on that. And in a similar way, social media becomes the monopoly on communication expression. Now, if you look at our future generations, like 10 years old, then they haven't grown up with any inkling of the kind of culture that, say, you and I grew up with. I imagine we're about the same age or near enough or, you know, whatever, 10 years apart. But still, we have got some memory of being able to get together without digital technology, okay? Whereas future generations, they ain't going to have that. So it's, again, it goes back to Orwell and Newspeak, where the system takes over our means, our instruments of communication. It takes over our language, the nuances of our understanding of the world. And as such, it creates a new breed of kind of human being, you know, as a consequence of all of that. Because, for example, if you look at a lot of the protest movement now around coronavirus, they're all using, you know, Facebook groups to communicate, okay? Now, if those groups ever gathered the kind of momentum that presented a serious threat to the state, like 1 million people that were about to activate a demonstration at, say, Parliament, Facebook would shut that group down. They'd have no means, okay, of communicating because they have not developed the kind of backup plans, you know?
Yeah, and even with these sort of alternative media platforms, like there's a Parler, there's another one that sort of, there's a few, you know, maybe there's something to that. I don't know. I haven't really looked into it, but at the same time, my suspicion is that, as you say, once anything gets to a certain, and it seems like, you know, once anything gets to a certain level in this society, you kind of have to pass certain thresholds of just like, right, are you down with the program here? Yes, okay, you can pass through to the next level, and the further up you go, the more compromised it's become.
Yes. Well, you rely on investment to get there. You can't bootstrap it yourself, so you have to go to the venture capital, private equity, and with that comes the terms and conditions.
Yeah.
So no matter how independent these new, you know, platforms are of social media, if they do reach kind of critical mass, they're going to get bought out and they're going to get compromised. I mean, there are exceptions to the rule. You've got, for example, BitChute, you know, and he's very, you know, he seems to be kind of very committed to his principles, that guy. But what is the takeaway from that? The takeaway is that we need to start developing our own resources, okay? I think that the state corporations, they operate on the principle of subscription, okay? these are services that we can choose to subscribe to or choose not to subscribe to. And when we stop subscribing to them, they turn into things like the Walkman or Betamax. They just fade away. They become obsolete because they don't have a subscription. Now, when we stop subscribing to this corporate behemoth, then and start developing our own technologies, this is one way that we can create, a revolution, because they're only as relevant as our kind of faith, in a subscription.
Yeah, it reminds me of a short story by Stanislaw Lem, the Polish science fiction writer, about an alien society in which there's a totalitarian government that is so effective that they have a concentration camp that doesn't have any walls. All they have to do, and maybe minimal guarding as well, all they have to do is that they tell the people who are going there, you're in the concentration camp now, and they just order themselves into this prison camp, and they stay there. And what you're saying about, we can create our own media is absolutely like sort of being in this society where everyone's kind of corralling themselves, or like sort of maybe, a large enough number of people are corralling themselves into these little sort of these prisons made, as you say, a lot of the time of language, to do with the way that we process the world linguistically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought in the transgender movement in your
because that's what Jordan Peterson was pointing out, is that the whole, because look, that statement on Off Guardian, bringing him into it was very controversial. Look, for me, the jury is out on Jordan Peterson, but it's about what he was saying, and I particularly like his gusto when it comes to countering the transgender movement, because at one point they were trying to make it a law in Canada whereby if you didn't call somebody by their preferred descriptor, you could go to prison, right? And what happened to Jordan Peterson is Google actually shut down his Google account. I don't know if you know that, but he lost everything, all of his documents that were in Drive, his all of the drafts of his books that he's writing were all in Drive and Google Docs. He lost his email account. He lost everything because they took offense to one of the videos he put out on YouTube. And that's an example of how, that's the co-opting of technology and our personal resources of communication. But what he said there, which I quoted, was that authoritarianism begins with those in charge trying to take over the linguistic landscape, which is another point that Orwell obviously touches upon in great detail in 1984, because what they're doing is they're deleting particular words from the dictionary. That's, Winston's job at the Ministry of Information, to remove words, because if you own and control those words and remove them, whether they be words like freedom or sovereignty, then the whole concept and framework of what those words mean, their ideologies, they can disappear over time. And certainly technology has got a carte blanche to do that. When you look back, I think I produced something, I wrote an article about Google recently, and I can't remember the actual statistics, but it's something like within 1 year today, we create as much data as we created throughout history, okay? All of the books and pamphlets, posters, all written material, in 1 year in modern times, we create the equivalent of our full, canon of data throughout history. Throughout history, publishers were independent. There was a diversity of them, producing a diversity of information for different social groups, okay? Now, what's going to happen over time, especially through products like the Kindle, Google becoming the de facto kind of go-to oracle for information, is that at some point we're going to lose printed literature. And we are going to be reliant on 2 or 3 corporations, Amazon, Google, and Apple, for all of our information. Now, that is really dangerous, to give a monopoly on information to a corporation, okay? Because we have survived, we have created cultures and diversities as a result of the diversity of information we've had access to throughout history. And I was talking to somebody that's very switched on about this recently, who basically he begged to differ with what I was saying, because he was saying, well, look, we have more access to information today than we've ever had. And true, yes, we do. We've got Wikipedia, for example, but what we fail to register is that it is lobbying companies, lobbying organizations and individuals who are writing all of that content. You know, the vast majority of it comes from a group of about 3,000 people. And all of them then represent, you know, political parties or, you know, big pharma, big tobacco, big industry, big banking. So we are sold on the kind of the sparkliness of the internet as being this incredible, comprehensive, diverse, neutral source of information. But we don't pick up on the subtle nuances. For example, Google is the biggest censor in history. They censor something like 100,000. Again, I've written about this, but it's something like 10,000 websites every day are censored by Google, right? And, you know, yeah. We are sold something on one kind of pretense. You know, it's the sizzle and not the sausage that we are sold on. Like, technology was presented as this sparkly kind of innovative toy to make our lives easier. More recently, Apple has secretly kind of downloaded the Health app onto our iPhones. You know, so we're kind of going back to Nazi Germany there, where you had to have your papers to, you know, show that you weren't Jewish or that you weren't a gypsy, that you were, you know, an upstanding member of the community, lest you be kind of put into a camp, a concentration camp. And likewise, technology is kind of taking on that role now, with Apple surreptitiously kind of planting technology. At some point, with the contact tracing, then technology will know, our phones, for example, will no longer be these things that serve us. They will become the things that serve the system, that help the system to manage us as people, you know? And it's interesting to kind of look at that and understand, gosh, has this been planned? Has this always been part of the plan with technology? Or is it something that has randomly just occurred? In the same sense that, why is Bill Gates, for example, who's a very shrewd businessman, why has he been so committed to vaccinations and pandemics? Is it because he has understood that therein is a wonderful opportunity for control, for making money, you know? Do we look on that as a coincidence that Bill Gates has been so committed to vaccination programs and, you know, simulating pandemics?
Yeah, it's all that's a whole fascinating topic in itself, specifically with Bill Gates. And I think there's a few different kind of angles you can take on him as a man, and also his organization, the Gates Foundation. You know, on one level you can say, well, he's just a bit of an ambitious, you know, former computer tech kind of mogul who just really wants to essentially secure his legacy as being, you know, a really important man, you know, the most important man of the 21st century. And he's decided, okay, well, vaccination seems to be a good way of kind of buying some kind of legacy of, okay, he vaccinated, you know, so many millions of children against such and such a disease. So that kind of gives him this sort of, you know, and he's spent a huge amount of money funding media outlets to sort of generate this saintly image of himself. But then, you know, as I've had an interesting discussion about this recently with some people on the dreaded Facebook about Bill Gates, and you know, one of the things I've kind of brought up was that I don't know that we can fully discount. I mean, I'm not going to say Bill Gates is the Antichrist. Bill Gates wants to just exterminate 80% of the world's population, because I don't know that. But I don't entirely know that the fact that his father,
Planned Parenthood,
was very much deeply interested in
eugenics. I'm writing about this at the moment, yeah. And Margaret Sanger was her mentor was the guy that founded eugenics. Havelock Ellis, who was president of the Eugenics Society, he was not only the mentor, he was a lover of Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, and Bill Gates Sr. was company head. So there's something very dark there about somebody who wants to sustain populations, okay, through vaccinations, who is also like, comes from this heritage of actually culling populations, of birth control. You know, I think at that point the alarm bells start ringing, you know. And not only that, it's interesting, like the United Nations, for example, you know, United Nations was like founded by a guy called Algar Hiss, who was a communist spy who was jailed for perjury. He was kind of State Department US, but he was like the one of the founders. He wrote the UN Charter. And when you look at the UN, he was a socialist, right? So socialism goes back to Fabianism, which goes back to eugenics in general, because there's a whole breed of these eugenicists and Fabians that have been involved in some of the most important global institutions. For example, the World Bank was established by John Maynard Keynes, who's a British economist and Fabian. And he set it up with a guy called Harry Dexter White, who was a communist defector. So again, you've got the UN, you've got the World Health Organization that was established by a guy called Brock Chisholm, whose whole mantra was about attacking the individual, bringing the individual down, creating the world citizen, treating individualism as a kind of type of neurosis, like any other infectious disease. He was a psychiatrist, and he petitioned the American government to institute 2 million psychiatrists in America to make psychiatry mandatory, especially amongst families, to breed out the individual. So again, it's another eugenicist. You've got Julian Huxley, another Fabian in eugenesis, who was the founding Director General of UNESCO, which is an organization that's devoted to, again, creating a one world culture. And going back to the UN, one of their biggest programs was the International Conference on Population and Development. And it's a 17 billion program to stabilize populations. And it includes sterilization and controlled human breeding. And it's all about eugenics, okay? So interestingly, you know, you've got this whole kind of playoff between like capitalism and socialism. And you've got so many people on the left throughout the pandemic who have been cheerleading for a more strenuous lockdown, like trade unions here in the UK wouldn't let schools go back. And I think there is something about that whole left movement that looks very humanitarian on its surface. And hence a lot of lefties have kind of looked at the lockdown and shutting down of the economy as being something very benign to humanity. It's almost like they believe the government is putting people first over money. But I don't believe that's the case. I think socialism is very smart because it brings people together who have very humanitarian kind of sympathies, you know, who want to care for the weakest links in society. But what they fail to register is that socialism is the most kind of potent form of totalitarianism, because it's all about creating collectivism. It's not about individuals. It's about all of us being cogs in the greater machine. You know, the state owning everything, the means of production. It's not the free market economy, it's the forced economy. And people fail to realize that when you give the state that level of power where it owns industry, you know, when you give the state that level of power, it will most certainly go wrong. You know, power equals corruption, centralization equals greed for more and more power. And the natural enemy of that whole system becomes the individual. And again, going back to the pandemic, you know, the WHO, who were one of these organizations founded by kind of the whole ancestors of Fabianism and eugenics and socialism in general, you know, is pushing obviously the pandemic. But if you look closely, I think they've taken a few of the UN promoted drivers that have been involved in climate change. I think this is something else that these global institutions use to create the conscious world citizen, to break down the borders of nation states, you know, to make us give things up, like our ill-conceived freedoms, you know, in return for protecting our weakest links in this sense of climate change. It's a fragile planet breathing its last. But it interesting, you mentioned eugenics, and, you know, I think there's definitely some conspiracy there that has been certainly very present following the Second World War in the preceding, you know, 20 years. Look at even Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. These are both Fabians, as is Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer. Again, they're Fabians, you know. And these are people pushing for world government. You know, Gordon Brown recently, and Tony Blair is again pushing for the mandatory kind of digital IDs. You know, these are all very deeply ingrained, like, dogmas of doctrines of control.
Yeah. Have you come across the work of Jason Horsley at all?
Jason Horsley, no.
He's written. I did actually a podcast with him recently for his Liminalist podcast.
Okay.
He's done quite a bit of work on the Fabian Society from a perspective of his own family history, as he's descended from Alec Horsley, who's the sort of Northern Foods magnate and a Fabian.
He's the Northern
Foods or Northern Dairies. There's
okay.
Quite a big, now quite a serious food conglomerate, I believe.
Okay.
And his grandfather knew you know the key Fabian players, as well as also my own great grandfather. So I'm sort of descended a little bit from this line as well, because
Right.
great grandfather was J.B. Priestley.
J.B. Priestley, he sounds familiar.
Yeah, so he was very much active. Wasn't a Fabian, but he was very much active in the British left and
Right.
you know, in the campaign for nuclear disarmament and things like that.
He sounds very familiar.
Yeah, you would have probably seen him maybe in reference to relationship to UNESCO, because he would have worked with UNESCO. And one of the real eye-opening moments for me was like looking into my family history, my great-grandfather's family history, his connection, people like Julian Huxley, and then reading sort of documents written by Julian Huxley for UNESCO about like sterilize the unfit and all this kind of.
It's really heavy stuff, man. It's very, very dark.
Very dark. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, as you talk about the Fabians and the, you know, the nature of like putting this sort of, you know, the putting the progressive, lovely socialist gloss on an ideology which at its core is quite dark and quite right-wing and fascistic in many
Yes, it is. The most. It doesn't get more right-wing and fascist and totalitarianism than the government being this big brother type, like huge leviathan that owns and controls everything. And at some point, we've got to start kind of asking, well, if John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White formed the World Bank and the IMF, which are apparently the kind of apparatus of neoliberalism, and that, of course, all of these problems that have resulted in us now being in debt 3.2 times our GDP, that it is all of this manufactured to push us more towards socialism in the sense of totalitarian socialism. You know, are the markets being intentionally crashed? And if you look at the US right now, you know, they're taking over the means of production. The economy has become a forced economy rather than a free market economy. They're commandeering private corporations to forcibly make medical supplies. We've got the universal basic income. We've got bailouts for self-employed and small businesses. Boris Johnson's talking about a New Deal. We've had the kind of communist doorstep salutations for health workers, and more recently for Nicola Sturgeon. And this is like how party members used to kind of praise the communist leaders in the Soviet Union. You know, all countries follow China's lockdown protocols. So it looks like there is a massive move towards socialism here, you know, because of course, this is like the natural place that any authoritarian will end up. The whole free market economy thing isn't of interest to authoritarians, creating competing, you know, cultures and you know, revenue streams. You know, this is not what good old-fashioned authoritarians want. They want a monopoly on everything. And then you look at the history of the Fabians, like George Bernard Shaw, who is a kind of founding member along with the kind of the Webbs, Sidney Webb and Beatrice Webb. But Shaw said, under socialism, you would not be allowed to be poor. You would be forcibly fed, clothed, lodged, taught, and employed whether you liked it or not. If it were discovered that you had not the character or industry enough to be worth all this trouble, you might possibly be executed in a kindly manner. But whilst you were permitted to live, you would live well. So this whole notion of Fabianism is kind of sold to the working man as something that's going to free them from the bondage of the day, free them from the very elitism that is exploiting them. But that's how it's sold. But actually what it is it's like co-opting the working classes, you know, as we're talking earlier about co-opting activism. It's basically, socialism is not the benign driving force that would free the working class, but rather it's the terms of their emancipation that's designed to take stock of what was the brooding discontent of the times from what were the mightiest social segment, you know, the working classes in the day were like the vast majority. But they are themselves the gravest threat to the particular brand of elitism that Fabianism belongs to, right? So you kind of look back at this and you wonder, wow, did the working class of the day kind of embrace Fabianism as this, you know, saving grace in the same way that people today are embracing like the face mask and the government countermeasures to coronavirus as being the saving grace, you know, in the same way that the Americans were pushed into the First World War, not because of the threat of Russia, but because the American banks had overfinanced the British and the French and were destined to lose billions of dollars if the Allies, you know, didn't beat Germany in World War I. And the American government then, to support its banks, went against their election pledge. Woodrow Wilson had gone into power a second time, promising that he wouldn't take the US to war. But he did so under the sinking of one of the British ships, where there was like 85 US passengers on board. But the ship was also carrying, you know, bullets and munitions, armaments to the British. But they went in under the auspices of protecting the free world, but it later emerges through letters that we can now read from Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, that no, the reason they went to war was because they needed to protect JP Morgan and Rockefeller investments. So again, at the time, the American people would have been sold on that war under one, you know, condition, and that is protecting the free world, in the same way that we are now being sold on all of the sacrifices we're making for, you know, through coronavirus to protect our weakest links. There is constantly, you know, a very deceitful narrative, I think, at the very heart of all political agenda, which people, they fail to register that in the moment.
Going back to people having sort of grown up with this technology as well, is that, you know, as you say, we might be sort of, you know, the last generation that dimly remember a time sort of before the internet really took off in a big way, you know, and what a different kind of world it was, and how, I mean, I sort of grew up a little bit in kind of anarcho kind of green movement times of the sort of 80s and 90s.
Swampy,
yeah, exactly.
The M11 link road in Wanstead, you know that? They wrote to the UN and they asked for a peacekeeping force to be sent to Wanstead because they denoted themselves the independent state of Wanstead, right? Who were under attack from the British government. I mean, obviously there's a bit of tongue-in-cheek art project in that, but this is real activism.
Well, this was the thing. It's like that there were these, you know, there were these authentic grassroots movements that probably had all kinds of infiltrators and all kinds of people like circling around the edges, but there was just something. There was something there that I think, just partly because of the relative kind of simplicity of propaganda methods at that point, prior to the internet and prior to algorithmically
Yes.
controls, that people kind of had this ability to sort of actually, there was some sort of connection to objective reality still left, whereas now, you know, you have a whole generation of young people who've grown up, born after 9/11, you know, born after the rise of the internet, lots of people, very vulnerable, lonely people, you know, getting caught up into ideas of identity and sort of these strange ephemeral ideas of identity.
Yes.
I mean, it gets very tricky talking about it, because people adopt ideas, take them into their own souls, and then if you question them, it's like you're questioning their right to exist, as often talked about in terms of the transgender. But to give one example is like, but you know, you can't talk about this because you're questioning people's right to exist. Like the whole frames of the debate are, the terms of the debate are framed and rigged from the beginning there.
Yes.
This isn't about people's right to exist. This is about what's healthy and good for you as people, as vulnerable people. This may not be what you need. You may be being sold something through a mix of algorithmic randomness and also deliberate kind of strange, you know, state co-optation that may not actually be good for your being. You know?
If you look at the climate change movement, okay, it all goes back to a guy called Maurice Strong, and he is like the man who put climate change on the map. Basically, he created the multi-billion-dollar climate change industry because it's worth billions, hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars. It's a very lucrative business. But he put it on the map, and he is an oil man, a billionaire oil man at that. And obviously, you know, it goes back to the kind of thing that Einstein said, is that you can't fix the problem using the same thinking that got you into it. So what an oil man is doing as the kind of the champion of climate change is just, you know, astounding that people were bought and sold on that premise. But he's the guy that set up the all of the various United Nations, you know, organizations on climate change that include United Nations Environmental Programme, the Panel on Climate Change, the ticking time bomb of the Kyoto Protocol. You know, all of these things circle back to this guy, Maurice Strong, you know. And, you know, when you look at this guy's whole legacy and history, it is very checkered. Like, he basically built, like, resorts in conservation areas. You know, he was a big sort of defender of conservation, but he defied the conservation rules by building a resort in Costa Rica that should have had approval from the Kakoldi Indian Association. He didn't get it. But at the same time, he's one of the guys pushing conservation, okay? But yet he doesn't actually, you know, follow the very rules that he creates. A bit like Professor Lockdown and Dominic Cummings, you know, the political establishment don't follow the very rules that they enforce for the common person. But this guy Strong is also very connected to Chairman Mao and communism and socialism. He's a socialist, and his cousin was like a very famous journalist called Anna Louise Strong, who lived in China and basically was the kind of Chinese correspondent on communism for Western media. She became a very good friend with Chairman Mao. And when this guy Strong actually retired later in life, he retired in China because he was implicated in the oil for food crisis during the Iraq War. So he committed fraud in the oil for food program, and the US government, the State Department, wanted to get him into court, and he fled and he went to China. But again, when it comes to climate change, we never question what are the origins? Can we follow the money? Who put this on the map? And when you look a little bit more closely, you see that it's the very same kind of, you know, elitist, in this instance again, socialist, you know, billionaires club. Again, it's been the baby of the United Nations in the same sense that the World Health Organization has given birth to the pandemic. And I think there are very similar kind of algorithms that have been followed in both instances, you know, like climate change would, you know, climate change activists basically do the same work on the level of civil society that the UN does in on the level of nation states. So the UN gears up nation states on climate change. Activists like Extinction Rebellion gear up civil society towards the very same outcomes. And, you know, what we're looking at here is they're peddling privations, you know, austerity, collectivism, you know, the strict conditions that we must give up our ill-conceived freedoms in return for protecting our weakest links, whether that's an 80-year-old who might be infected by us because we don't wear the face mask, or a fragile planet breathing its last. It is the same roadmap to collectivism as expressed in both agendas. And interestingly, I think you mentioned technology a moment ago. It is inevitable that we reach a place like this that we've just reached with technology. It was only a matter of time before we got to this level, because the state never had this level of apparatus before to control us, to predict us, okay? So for example, in my opinion, each time they bring in a new policy or law here in the UK, what they do first is they monitor social media, because they gauge just how much buy-in the general public has, what percentage of the people are basically, you know, following and being subservient to the push, you know. And if they see that 60% of people don't want to wear face masks, then they're going to make them mandatory. But if they see, what they'll do in that case is they'll continue with the propaganda and the behavioral kind of manipulation in order to build up enough of a critical mass of, you know, people that are, you know, following that agenda. So it was only inevitable that we would get to a place like this, I think, with technology.
And when I speak to friends of mine about things like, you know, say climate change, I mean, a point that's raised, and I've got a few friends who are kind of ranging from, like, they believe in climate change, they're very skeptical, or they're kind of agnostic. And one of the issues that sort of comes up is, you know, how is it possible that, you know, you've got all of these different independent scientists working in different organizations all through the world who are kind of coming to the same sorts of conclusions? And it's a tricky one. And I've a sense though with sort of man-made climate change, carbon dioxide driven climate change, is that, as I'm an agnostic about it, but I suspect that for whatever reason, that's become the thing on which to hang the environmental movement, because it's convenient, like whether it's been you know, exaggerated or not. And certainly there's some dodgy statistical manipulation going on the pro side of the argument. As I mean, when the CRU email leak thing happened about 10-11 years ago now, that was my, which I had been having my doubts for a few years, having been.
What was that exactly?
So the a climate research unit at East Anglia University, which provides the data, I think provides a good amount of the data, or at least processes the data for the IPCC. A series of emails between, I think it was Michael Mann and some other scientists working in the CRU unit, revealed that they had actually been trying to fudge the statistical data a little bit to make the warming look worse, because actually 1998 was the world's warmest year on up to that date, and there actually had been a slight cooling trend since then.
Wow.
So it's very tricky, and, like, you know, I'm not a climatologist, and I'm sure that there are, you know, many climate scientists who could pick up whatever it is I say about the matter and sort of take it apart. But at the same time, I do wonder if there's also this effect of a writer I like brought this in, a guy called John Michael Greer, who's writes about peak oil and stuff. He mentioned something called Hagbard's Law, which is from the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson.
Okay, I've got that book here.
Yeah, and that's essentially the idea of Hagbard's Law, is that truthful information can only be communicated between equals.
Right, that's beautiful. I like that a lot.
Yes.
That's great.
The idea that essentially that your superiors in an organization will have their own kind of agenda. They have their own ideology that you'll want to sort of promote that for them. Your work will kind of be confirming their ideas, their work confirming the ideas of the people above them. So without even too much of a massive conspiracy of all these, like just floating it out, like, and again, you know, just to clarify for the viewers or listeners, I'm agnostic on climate change, but as an idea that if you just pour enough money into let's find evidence for CO2 driven man-made climate change, then you need money as a scientist.
Yeah. Now, look, don't forget that I think it was in 2003, Forbes magazine estimated that 150 billion was being spent on climate change, okay, and green subsidies. And particularly under Obama, that was like accelerated. And statistics I looked at from the Office of Management and Budget Reports, the federal climate change budget in 2017 was 13.2 billion, okay? Now, what does that mean? That means, and another important bit of information there is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act on the Climate Energy Transformation, that is a 2010 act. It created more than 80,000 clean energy jobs, okay? And it invested 90 billion in government investments and tax incentives to lay the foundation of clean energy. So what that means is you've got 80,000 people being employed that are being paid according to that budget. Now they're being paid to corroborate and uphold the climate change story. You asked earlier why so many scientists around the world are universally all agreeing. Well, it's not all scientists because there are some that debunk climate theory. But if you want to know why there is concord amongst so many scientists, you need to follow the money. Because these guys are getting paid, okay, to corroborate the story. And if they write a paper that debunks the story, they lose their funding. And it's very similar to the pandemic in that when you look at the kind of the tentacles of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in its funding, whether it be the BBC or the Guardian or Professor Ferguson or Fauci or the CDC or the Johns Hopkins Institute, all of these institutions and individuals, they are dependent upon the funding that they get from Bill Gates, from his foundation, okay? And the whole kind of, the money system is rigged in such a way that it would be very easy to kind of manipulate that scientific consensus on either issue, whether it's climate change or coronavirus, based on, you know, controlling the money supply. And that's the first point. The second issue you raised was, and I think it's a very important one, is environmentalism. Like climate change provides a very nice orthodox place for environmentalists to go to. So Swampy, your own track record back in the day, my own, of being, you know, an anarcho kind of, you know, radical, like that went to the Reclaim the Streets free parties back in the day that you might remember. The Extinction Rebellion looks awfully familiar with, although back in the day we were protesting our rights, our sovereignty, we wanted to reclaim spaces. These are real tangible issues that are scalable, not climate change, not some abstract. But I think within the environmental movement, there has been some very radical people. For example, conservation, you know, there is a lot of merit in conservation. We are fast killing diversity. And animals like rhinos and zebras that once roamed the earth en masse are now kind of, they're almost like, you know, animals inside a goldfish bowl that, you know, exist charitably within like a very small kind of sphere within our world. So there are some very noble causes, like the amount of plastic we're producing and its impact on the planet, and monoculture and how that destroys the soil, and Monsanto and GM crops and all of these things. These are very noble causes that are very dangerous to the geopolitical agenda, you know, because they could potentially disrupt, you know, very important industries. But climate change, what it does, it provides a very safe refuge to those people that would otherwise be protesting, I think, very insurgent causes.
Yeah, absolutely. With kind of demonizing this one particular molecule of CO2, you open the door for all kinds of new technologies that will make money for various kinds of industries. You know, I've made this point to people involved in Extinction Rebellion that, you know, net zero carbon doesn't mean zero carbon. It means you've got your carbon budget and you've got things that cancel it out. And those can't really do that effectively at the scale that they're talking about that we need. I mean, if we're really talking quite seriously about, you know, human extinction within our lifetime, which I really doubt, to be honest. But, you know, okay, well, let's run with that. So human extinction within our lifetime, then net zero carbon just isn't even going to vaguely cut it, because all it's going to do is the oil companies love net zero because they can carry on. They go, oh, well, we planted, you know, 1 billion trees over here, and often that will, just planting trees by itself, as you say, monoculture, necessarily mean that you've got a good ecosystem there, you know. And a lot of what's happening now with the green movement, as has been, you know, documented particularly by people like Corey Morningstar on the Wrong Kind of Green, and her research on things like the New Deal for Nature, which is a land grab of a
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it places, what is it? It places the rights of a rock over a sentient human being. You know, a lot of this, there is deeply ingrained ideologies of control that comes from that whole movement that is particularly worrying.
Yeah.
And I think to really like find your compass on anything, you know, there are a few golden rules, and one of which is, in my opinion, when the state and the media are behind something, okay, it doesn't have the social value. It just doesn't. It just doesn't operate like this. These guys are not interested in us. They're interested in themselves, you know. They're in it for themselves or for the club they swore their allegiance to in the first place that got them there. You know, very rarely do we find humanitarianism in, you know, in politics and business and industry. And it's, you know, I was writing something recently about my local, where I go and practice yoga. And throughout the lockdown, he's been sending out emails. And one of the emails, and it's quite a big studio, I won't mention who it is, but one of the emails, he was telling us that he had employed an expert on diversity, an independent external diversity officer, to come in and basically help gear him up to be in line with the new politically correct, you know, racial equality, Black Lives Matter. And when I saw this, I was like, hang on a second. Somebody that comes from the spiritual community should fully understand that when it comes to prejudice and racism, it's an internal reflection or an internal dialogue. We need to look inside ourselves to find the light and the truth. Outsourcing to a third party to come in and make sure we have enough people of color, ethnic minorities working in our establishment, it becomes then the whole corporate takeover of gay pride, you know? It's like these corporates, they're not waving the gay pride or the rainbow colors of coronavirus because they genuinely, you know, they are genuinely sensitive to those issues. They're doing so because it's popular, because it sells, you know, yoga classes, or it helps promote their business. And again, you know, it's we lose a sense of what our real values are in life when we reach this place that we're doing things because it seemed to be right rather than because they are right.
Yeah, with this kind of use of ideas like, you know, diversity, we're going to employ a diversity specialist, a diversity expert, to make sure that, you know, this is another industry developing, and a very corporate friendly one as well. So it allows, you know, L'Oreal. This was one of the most shocking examples of like corporate wokeness I saw, was L'Oreal that collaborated with the Nazis. They are 25% owned by Nestle, like one of the most potent organizations engaged in killing poor children across the third world right now. They're, you know, they use all kinds of toxic chemicals in their products. They probably test on animals and all the rest of it. And then they're lecturing, they're saying to you white people, you know, you need to own up to your privilege. And like, L'Oreal is owned by white people. Like, ordinary people, ordinary white people, about their. This is a corporation that has vast amounts of money, trying to like go, we're on the side of all this stuff, and you know how anyone can look at that.
Yeah.
And this is some kind of great step towards racial equality. Like, L'Oreal doesn't give a shit about racial equality. They never did. They never have. They never will.
It's almost like they are moving intentionally the goalposts of logic, you know, in the sense that a supermarket that is one of the biggest kind of bastions of plastic, single-use plastic, have the audacity to communicate to the consumer and lay the responsibility at our door for, you know, our, you know, wanting to use that plastic. But hang on a second, they haven't given us any options. They are part of the plastic industrial complex, more complicit than anyone else. Well, it's the manufacturer and it's the supermarket where the changes really need to occur, not within the consumer, you know, because we are further down the kind of the food chain of those products. So it's almost like they're trying to like subvert the entire logical territory with these things by shifting, you know, the burden of responsibility, or misinterpreting the kind of the I don't know, it's a difficult one, but yeah, it's just another manifestation, I think, of a very corrupt and upside down planet.
Yeah, with these things, like, I mean, it's also interesting to look at the kinds of things that aren't being talked about in relationship to, you know, these contemporary movements. So let's take, you know, racial justice, Black Lives Matter is one thing, and it's like that, you know, it gets, I'm sure for listeners it would be like, two white guys talking about Black Lives Matter, you know, maybe they need to check their privilege, like that. I'm not in any way saying that there wasn't some authentic core of an issue there that actually sparked off the movement that then certain organizations called Black Lives Matter seem to have taken hold of. And, you know, the context around that I'm not too familiar with, but there may be there's certainly, you know, Soros dollars have gone into the Black Lives Matter movement, and we know that for sure, as you've written about yourself. And it's also interesting to look at how, well, you know, that there are these horrific acts of police brutality that happen, and often that these then are used almost to re-traumatize people. And I've spoken about this, you know, with friends of mine, people of color, and what a traumatic time it must be to go through this right now, and to have, you know, their own personal experiences kind of then brought up by these videos, these horrific videos that then, you know, spark off these movements that turn into, in some cases, turn into riots, and probably being, you know, directed in many cases by various kinds of deep state forces. But things that don't get talked about in the broader narrative about these things are things like, well, what is actually happening in Africa now? So the African neo-colonial land grabs of Africa by not just Western powers, but also by China as well. And exploitation of, and in some cases, attempted extermination of indigenous people by groups like the conservationists, like the WWF and New Deal for Nature. Exploitation of child labor in the Congo to produce the minerals that we need to make all of the instruments of technology that all of these kinds of social media platforms and tech giants rely on. You could take some of that stuff up and bring that into the contemporary narratives of racial injustice, totally relevant and very you could get a very shocking story of take a child from the Congo and get him to tell his story of his parents being murdered by militias, him being taken off to a cobalt mine, seeing the rainforest around him. But that narrative would be too challenging to the corporate establishment, because it's like suddenly the focus is on us. Oh, actually, maybe we're doing some bad stuff in the Congo. Just employ a diversity expert to make us look like we're doing okay, and then try and hope nobody talks about what's happening in Africa or in other places in the third world. So
as a side note to that, the United Nations recently published a report suggesting that 135 million people in Africa, mostly in Africa, but in other developing markets, were facing biblical scale famines as a result of interruption to the food supply chain that is a consequence of coronavirus. And this is one of my beefs with the Black Lives Matter movement, not with the people that are participating, but with the organization itself, because that is not a focal point. What is a focal point is the lives of those people in the US and in the UK. Interestingly, a film recently aired on Netflix by Spike Lee. And I don't know if it was the Five de Bloods film, but it was a movie that came out a couple of weeks ago that has Black Lives Matter as a theme within that film. And it's all about, the struggle of the Black man in America to, find his voice and his identity and his prosperity within the US. Ironically, it's made by a Black man who has, who is world famous, very successful, who has been given a wonderful platform. Spike Lee has been making movies, 20, 30 years. So that's really the irony there, is that, Spike Lee is making a movie about the exploitation of Black people in the US, yet he has been a real benefactor of the American dream. But not only that, what I found particularly interesting was that this movie had very current themes in it. And it looked like it was just produced as a response to the situation that happened with George Floyd. But no, this film had obviously been, in the making for a couple of years. But as if a stroke of good fortune, it kind of predicts or preempts the very current affairs that are going on. And it kind of makes me question whether there was some deliberate kind of roadmap to the whole Black Lives Matter movement. As I pointed out in the article, BLM's activity tends to spike every 4 years, always pre-election, because it is heavily politicized by the Democrats. And, African Americans make up a very large segment of Democrat voters in the US. So their activity always peaks just before an election. And I think one of the organizers of BLM came out recently to admit that part of their mission was to get Trump out of the White House. So it's almost like this film by Spike Lee was produced deliberately to be released a few months before the US elections were taking place. Again, it's a little bit of subterfuge and planning and coordination. It's not about telling a story there, it's about politicizing something. And unfortunately, Black Lives Matter happened at a time where people were starting to protest the barbaric and draconian lockdown. People were actually getting organized in the US. They were taking over courthouses. They were demonstrating en masse. Sometimes they had their amendment rights of actually carrying a gun. I personally attended a demo in Hyde Park. It was an anti-lockdown demonstration 1 week before Black Lives Matter happened. And I got a backlash from friends and allies on the left. Thought that it was just an appalling thing that I'd done by, you know, putting other people's lives at risk by going out and congregating and basically using my universal, you know, human right to actually protest. Ironically, a week later, the BLM protest happens. It serves as a very convenient airbrush to kind of whitewash the greater pains that everyone is experiencing as a result of the wholesale theft of their human rights. And of course, people start cheerleading the BLM protests. The very same people that were giving me a hard time for demonstrating the lockdown were cheerleading, you know, the BLM protests, as were politicians and the media. You know, like complete hypocrisy. But again, what that tells us, what that expresses to somebody capable of critical thinking, is that there is an agenda there. You know, that is a very clearly co-opted movement that serves a very important purpose, and that is to whitewash the bigger story that is everyone's rights. But also, it's a very arcane method of divide and rule, because what it does is it separates us into factions, into groups, into segments, color. So when you look on Facebook, it went from 1 minute, one day, the narrative being all about the lockdown. In most circumstances, it was people actually cheerleading the lockdown. There was a small community of my friends that were actually questioning it. But all of a sudden, that then transformed into a dialogue about BLM. So all of a sudden, we have these orthodoxies that are given to us by the state, that are presented to us as kind of people-powered grassroots movements that operate on, you know, out of chaos and that are random. They are not contrived or controlled, but they serve a very important agenda because they distract us. You know, as I pointed out in the article, the day that Julian Assange was arrested at the Ecuadorian embassy, I kind of ran to the front page newspapers the next day expecting there to be some big take up on the story and hopefully to hear some, you know, sympathetic, you know, front page news content from the very media organizations that had colluded with Assange and benefited from, you know, the WikiLeaks, trove of information. But no, the very next day, the front page of all the newspapers was Extinction Rebellion. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, these are very coincidental events, and I do not believe that those that are in control, because it is a very, you know, the game that is played on a geopolitical level, you know, it's like a game of chess played by grandmasters. There is very little room for error or accident or coincidence in the way that that game is played. And things that happen, they happen because they're meant to happen.
Yeah. And it's hard for people to accept that, I think, because it just, first of all, it's very difficult to prove any of this stuff. Absolutely. So, you know, first of all, it's like, well, but how do you know that? And you go, well, you just kind of, it's obvious when it's obvious. That's the thing. Is that, as you're saying, like, you know, if you look at all of the state and media institutions suddenly falling in lockstep with or mostly for, like, you know, the BLM thing, like the Tory party was less keen on board, you know, but, you know, Keir Starmer had that ridiculous photo shoot where he's kneeling in his office and he looks like he's about to sort of fall over because he's slightly off balance. And then, you know, you've got all these, you know, then suddenly the same exact media institutions and people, as you're saying, 1 week before, were saying these lockdown protesters are disgusting, immoral murderers, and then 1 week later, oh, but you know, you can go protest the racism because yeah, that's fine. Do that.
It's sponsored. It's orthodox. It's an orthodoxy.
Okay, you know, and as I think it was on James Corbett's show, they were talking about the riots and the protests, and they were saying that really, in actuality, that these could be just the great COVID riots of 2020, of just huge lumpen proletarian class out,
yeah,
pissed off, no,
Yes.
you know, in addition to also their own experience of police brutality, but, you know, just a general animosity towards the state, towards institutional society, towards their own, you know, often it was their own neighborhoods that they were tearing apart, and their own neighbors, and this just general just explosion of frustration and rage. And then it's all, you can just put this little kind of like flimsy hat on it that makes it look like one thing that's okay.
Yeah.
You've got this very amorphous and weird kind of social
Yeah.
going on underneath.
And all of a sudden it gathers great momentum. So to the point where people just forget. They forget about the ethical grounds of the lockdown, and they forget about their frustrations. I do but firmly believe that had been in the pipeline, that something along those lines, some kind of plan, once the level of tension, the tiger locked in the cage for 3 months, reached a kind of, you know, critical levels of being annoyed with the state and ready to go out there and, you know, create hell and sedition and protest and reclaim the power, that there was always something in the pipeline, you know, to mitigate that. Because as you say, the whole, you know, the political media influences all being in lockstep, you know, this is just too, you know, there is no diverse view that is expressed within that either. Everybody follows the same protocols, from Keir Starmer through to Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. All the while, there is the wholesale theft of our human rights, of everybody's universal rights are being destroyed right now. And that becomes kind of page 14 rather than front page.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose just before we finish up today, I suppose I'd like to go back to this point you raised at the beginning about the spiritual kind of effects of the lockdown, and you know, that in a way that this this sort of, you know, banning on touch and banning on human, you know, enforced distancing of human contact feels in many ways, I mean, it doesn't seem to me like there's a huge amount of scientific research to justify that, and and perhaps it's just, you know, incompetent bureaucrats trying to come up with policies on the fly. But it does have, even if that's the case, it has the accidental byproduct of kind of shutting down people's ability to communicate with each other in that authentic embodied level that would actually just mean that people are being human, and, you know, therefore are difficult to control, because humans are natural beings, and you can't control a natural being very easily. You have to kind of constrain it.
Yeah. Well, this is it, because we are natural human beings, and we, you know, operate on the premise of spontaneity. We have random actions. You know, it's like chaos theory. That's no good to the system, because the state is a set of traffic lights that wants to control and regulate the flow of life, that begins with commerce and the monetary system, but slowly it pervades into just about all aspects of life, as we've been discussing, culture, and now it's human interaction. The point you made a moment ago that is quite interesting is the scientific premise. Now, I might be wrong. I don't think we have ever embarked upon a lockdown before throughout, you know, history. Even with the Spanish flu, was there social distancing that happened without that? So, if that is the case, then yes, there is no scientific premise, because it's never been tested, and something needs to be tested first before it can be verified. When you look at things like attachment theory and you study the ways in which primates communicate, language is a very small part of that. A lot of our communication is expressed in body language and facial gestures. Now, you try having a conversation with somebody in a supermarket that's wearing a face mask. it's very difficult to understand what's going on. In the same way that when you sit in a restaurant with a woman on a first date, you don't really go by the words she expresses to understand, you know, how feasible this situation is with this woman. You go by her body language, by her facial expression. She may say one thing, but you follow the facial gesticulations. Now, the face mask, it creates an immediate, you know, a buffer to that. So it is a very dehumanizing appendage that we are now, you know, putting onto society. And you add to that the social distancing, people kind of standing 2 meters apart, people swerving and dodging each other. It's almost like you are seeing a serial killer amongst the crowd, and you are dodging that person because you fear for your life or the life of your loved ones. And this is a very dark and dangerous place for us to land in as a humanity, whereby our trust in each other has gone. Our ability to come together cohesively, to share information, you know, to learn from one another is gone. We are trapped at home. Our instruments of information and communication are technology. This is very dangerous. This is corporatized paradigms that are now in charge of our most important touchstones of expression of interpersonal relations. I believe that coronavirus is a big attack on spirituality, because I think the spiritual path, it kind of teaches us to trust the process. It's one of the takeaways of spirituality, is being in the moment, relinquishing the kind of worldly illusions. And a large part of that, of being in the moment, relinquishing the worldly illusions, is flowing in the river in time, in sync towards the place that we're going. We're all going towards death. This is the inevitability of life. Every time, for each birth, death is hard-coded into that process. It's non-negotiable, okay? And it is one of the few things that truly belongs to us. Ironically, though, the two greatest events that happen in our lifetime we're not present at. So, for example, our birth is someone else's celebration. Our death is the misfortune of others. And what are the takeaways from that? Well, perhaps how little control we really have over the outcomes of life. However, our death and our birth, these are ours. These are inalienable properties that belong to us. However, coronavirus, basically, it licenses government and the state and institutional authority to be superior to nature, as if the state has more of a vested interest in our life or understands better our path in this life than nature itself. It's man again playing God. But it really, I think, attacks at a fundamental level spirituality and our level of surrender to life, our ability to be in the moment, because it attacks that. It's almost like if you as a person act carelessly by disobeying our laws, you are putting your life and other people's lives in jeopardy. Okay, and they're almost presenting that as being a crime. So that's a real perversion there, because my life is mine to do with it as I please, you know. So, you know, interpreting the message from most spiritual systems, I think there is a teaching that kind of resonates within the context of being in the moment, surrendering to the journey, which also involves the inevitability of death, gracefully approaching that moment in our lives, rather than trying to fight and resist it, okay? And, you know, there is a fundamental attack upon that sovereignty that takes aim at our spiritual essence, that kind of interrupts our ability to trust. And it causes a cognitive dissonance between, you know, our better nature that feels safe. Our nature, my nature right now feels perfectly safe. And it feels like I am, you know, nurtured within this moment of reality. But if I start tuning into the media, then my alarm bells start ringing and fear starts, you know, taking control. And that cognitive dissonance of fear versus nature is perhaps another byproduct of what is happening with coronavirus. It's very clever, because it's not just other people's lives you might put at risk by doing the most basic of human kind of things that we do, that is shaking hands or being close to one another or sharing space. But it's also your own life that you're putting in jeopardy. And that is, I think, a real perversion.
Well, it's been a fascinating chat. Great to make contact with you, and I'm sure if you're up for it, we'll schedule another talk like this, as I'm sure a lot more that we will have to talk about, and many more events that will transpire in the meantime that will be good fodder. But before we go, would you like to tell us where we can find your work online?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me at thecogent.org. So that's www.thecogent.org. You can also find me on Twitter, thecogent1.